prices. Industry is responsible for 41% of electricity consumption, meaning that this will be about 105 billion euros to implement this particular measure as a cost on industry. In addition, the third phase of the EU's emissions trading scheme for reduction of carbon emissions is now under discussion. It is estimated that as of 2013, this will cost around 102 billion a year for companies. And it should be particularly noted that many of Europe's key export industries, so chemicals and automotive, for example, are particularly carbon-intensive industries, and so they would be particularly sensitive to such cost increases. I should note here that, of course, companies are fully support the objective of fighting climate change, but we insist that these efforts take place on a level playing field with other regions of the world. Exchange rate movements are having different, but on balance difficult effects for Europe's export competitiveness. Firstly, exports of different countries have different sensitivities to the price implications of exports of exchange rate movements. So high value, high-end German exports, for example, tend to be less sensitive than the exports of France. Another factor to consider in the ambiguous effect of exchange rate movements is the fact that the rise of the euro has insulated Europe to a large extent from the increases in oil and commodity prices over recent years. However, for sectors that compete on price, and again, textiles, electronics, chemicals, the rise of the euro has had an effect on their international competitiveness. And when you look at the fact that we're looking at a real effective appreciation of 30%, so taking account labour costs, inflation, and the weighting of the exchange rate with the particular trading partners which we are most engaged with, that is a significant figure for those companies. In terms of China, I think it should be mentioned that it is a major factor challenging EU exports in world markets. China's own share of world exports has doubled between 2000 and 2006, moving to 11% of world trade. Now, we must remember, of course, that EU exports to China have been increasing at 20% per year, so China is also considered an opportunity for us. And we must also note that the EU has been affected less by China's rise than has the US and Japan, for example. But certainly in key markets, as we saw earlier in the US, in Russia, and other major markets in Asia, China has been a factor in the EU's loss of market share. The final challenge we face is in terms of market access. So in today's high-growth markets in Asia, in the ASEAN countries, in India, in Korea, in China itself, Europe's market penetration remains limited. This is hampered by many factors, including high tariffs at the border, but also, and increasingly so, a whole range of non-tariff barriers. So, certification requirements, customs procedures, permits, lack of commitment to international standards, all of which means that it is very difficult for EU companies to export to many of the most dynamic regions of the world. Furthermore, in our largest trading partner, the United States, which accounts for 23% of EU exports, the large trade deficit that the US is experiencing, and also the difficult economic conditions at present, are pointing towards a more protectionist policy from the US, possibly in the future. Should there be, and we should emphasize that this is definitely a should there be any increasing protectionist measures in practice from the US, we need to be sure that the EU is not caught up in any such action. So to summarize, Business Europe will make, on the basis of this study, once it is finalised, a series of policy recommendations to support EU exports on a global scale. In a nutshell, the message is the following. On the Lisbon agenda, just do it. We've been at this for over 8 years now, so we must complete the internal market so that we have greater economies of scale for EU companies. We must encourage innovation in member states by spending on R&D, by improving links between universities and business, but also by establishing a single European harmonised patent, which is an objective that has been on the books for some 20 years. We must also employment rates. Labour market reforms across the European Union are being implemented, but more needs to be done to put the principle of flex security into practice. On climate change, we must note that it will be impossible to achieve this without competitiveness. Companies are ready and willing to play their part in these efforts, but if industry in other world regions is not subject to the same limitations as in Europe, the result of EU measures will simply be to shift the production of manufactured goods outside of the EU to other fields with no added benefit for the environment. On exchange rates, our message is to be coherent. Business Europe is a strong supporter of the work of the European Central Bank and of its independence, but we believe that there is a scope for greater coordination between Eurozone finance ministers so that they can act together in international economic fora such as the G7 meetings of finance ministers, such as the International Monetary Fund, so that we can have an improved exchange rate policy. As regards China, our message is to enforce the rules. The implementation of the rules clearly needs to be improved in China. EU exports to China are often hampered by loss of damages to intellectual property rights. Chinese exports to the EU are often aided by illegal government subsidies. And so, though a strong and constructive relationship between the EU and China is vital for our future economic development and future stability, it is clear that the EU should not shy away from using the World Trade Organization's dispute settlement mechanism to enforce the rules and to ensure a level playing field for companies. The last point is on market access, and there are messages to open doors for EU companies. The EU is negotiating a number of trade agreements at present. In the global round of WTO negotiations, we have been negotiating again since 2001. The current offer on the table from emerging countries, in Brazil, India, and Asia, and China, must be improved. It does not sufficiently guarantee new market access for European companies into those markets, but we urge the EU to complete the door round and bring it to an ambitious conclusion as soon as possible. The EU is also in negotiation for a number of free trade agreements with the ASEAN countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and 7 others. It is in negotiation with Korea, and it is in negotiation with India in Asia, as well as some other agreements in Latin America and in Africa. All of these agreements should be concluded as soon as possible, but again, they must guarantee that there is real, effective market access for European business, and so they must also take into account non-tariff barriers as well as tariff management. Business Europe also recommends that we continue to have a strategic dialogue on trade, investment, and regulatory issues with our major partner, the United States. You may be aware that as of April of last year, there is a new transatlantic economic council in which these issues are discussed and debated. If a free trade agreement is proposed in the future with the United States, we may have to look into that seriously to counterbalance the measures that we have currently in terms of liberalization with the US. So,